Talk Show. Recorded live.
Good evening. Welcome to the December 12th, 2015 edition of Daily Talk, Researcher 135's Community Call, here on www.talkshoe.com. Tonight we're having a very interesting, very exciting return guest, Lawrence Cenotto, a world traveler who has now visited some 95 countries. And he's written 3 books about his travels and adventures, the different people he's met, the different experiences he's had, the different places he's been. And he'll be covering all of that tonight, as he did some of it earlier when he appeared the first time back in July. And that's an excellent show for those of you who have not heard that show before and not familiar with Lawrence Vernadeau. I recommend you go back, and it's recorded and archived here, and listen to the July 11th episode, which is the first time Lawrence Cenotto was my guest. Since then, he's visited many more countries, and I understand he has more trips planned in the future. His most recent book is titled True North 3, and he'll be talking a little about it tonight as well and explaining to us the definition of True North. That book, True North 3, as well as his other books, are available on Amazon. Some of the countries that he's visited in the past, of course, include Easter Island, Antarctica, Machu Picchu. He attended a Mardi Gras in Brazil, and he'll be talking a little about some of all of that tonight. I'm also going to follow up with him on some of the interesting cases that he dealt with in the first show that he was on. There was a young blind Ethiopian girl who was living in a very precarious makeshift dwelling that she'd constructed out of plastic and old umbrellas and what have you. And the place where she had positioned herself was just below a kind of a waste dump, and there was this very toxic water that was constantly coming down toward her. He rescued her from that, got her into a much safer and better living situation and environment, and we're going to follow up with him on her. Also, I'll be asking him about the Rwandan orphans, which he encountered, 60 of them in Rwanda, and he, along with some people affiliated with a church group there, I believe it was, is involved in the support and the help of these orphans, basically the adoption of these orphans. He's providing help to them. We'll also talk to him a little about the American businessman in a third world country who fell afoul of some corrupt and evil government officials there who, along with their cronies, decided to seize his business operation and actually incarcerated him, put him in jail for some 20 days, and seized his bank account, seized his property, and he basically emerged from jail virtually penniless and had to seek help from outside just to get money to operate on. And whenever he encountered Lawrence Cenotto, he explained the dire situation he was in, and Lawrence was able to facilitate a rescue of that gentleman as well. And Lawrence will follow up with us on that case as well. Imagine, if you will, what it would be like to travel to 95 different countries. That's absolutely amazing. It's a big world out there. Every country is a little different, socially and culturally and economically. The conditions vary widely worldwide, with many countries not approaching the level of comfortable lifestyle that we're used to as Americans. And one of the things that he encountered in so many countries was the dire poverty and the absolute lack of modern facilities and conveniences and technologies that we're so used to. And I see my caller from Illinois has a question. Sherry?
Yes, Rich. Yes. Hi, Rich. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you this evening?
I'm fine. I was
Great.
just curious. I know you were just talking about that he came out of the jail or prison, whatever, that, and he was virtually penniless. I was just wondering before that. It's not cheap to travel to other countries, and I was wondering how he financed his trips.
Well, that may be one of the things that Lawrence will go into. I'm sure some of it comes from the success of the first two books, which have been out for some time now, True North 1 and True North 2.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe there must be other means, too, that he has utilized in terms of his world travels. We didn't get into that a lot in the first show, but, certainly perhaps if he would like to elaborate on that, that would be very interesting, because I agree, airline flights, just even within the United States, have gone up astronomically over the past decade, and I can just imagine what the cost of flying worldwide to various countries must be. That must be an incredible expense. Of course, there are ins and outs. There's different ways of getting discounts. There's different ways of traveling on the cheap, as they say. There used to be a series of books out many years ago, how to visit South America on $15 a day or something like that. And I think that series was out back in the 70s. And now, of course, due to world economy and inflation, that figure would probably be considerably larger. But at one time, it was possible to visit different places. And if you knew what you were doing, get around and basically have a good time without spending a fortune. That's probably much, much more difficult these days. I do know that some of his travels have taken place probably by boat or ship, if I recall correctly from the first show. And one of the things he's encountered when he gets into certain countries is transportation. East and Central Washington, is that you, Lawrence Cenotto?
It is. Hi, Rich.
Well, welcome to the show. How are you this evening?
Moshing, as they say.
Well, that's
absolutely
fantastic.
Excellent. I'm actually out in Leavenworth, Washington, which is a awesome community that's kind of got a Bavarian theme to it on the east side of the mountains, and it's a really, really fun place. There's probably in a city of 2,000, there's probably 100,000 people here from out of town. They're here for the Christmas lighting ceremony. It's fabulous.
Wow. I'll bet you're thoroughly enjoying every minute of that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Lawrence,
the locals are very unfriendly, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're notoriously barbaric and pirate-like, but I managed to get by anyway.
Well, good. That's good to hear. So tell me, since you were on back in July, on the July 11th show, you visited now up to 95 countries. Tell me, how early did you get bitten by the travel bug?
Oh, my God. I don't know how early I was bit, but my parents took me to Mexico when I was 4, and I remember going to, for example, Mexico City and seeing the murals on the university there, the University of Mexico City, and how vivid they were. And I actually went to college, Pomona College in Claremont, California, and there was a very famous mural there by one of the artists who had done the murals in Mexico City. Sadly, I forget his name. But I remember that, and I remember the grinning gargoyles at the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, just outside Mexico City, which are world famous. Incidentally, those two pyramids are the exact same size in their base as the pyramids in Giza, in the Giza Plateau in Egypt. Now, what do you think the likelihood of that is? You think that's a coincidence?
Absolutely not. I'd say there has to be some connection between.
There's got to be some connection, and that's the beauty of trying to discover and doing research and doing travel, is trying to figure out what that connection is, how they had that connection. In fact, have you ever heard of the 100 Monkeys theory?
A little bit, but go ahead and elaborate on it for our listeners.
I can mention it briefly. The 100 Monkeys theory is that you've got a bunch of islands, and these monkeys are incommunicado in the fact that they are separated by a body of water, the sea, and yet when any of the monkeys on a particular island acquire a particular skill, and once they get to the 100th monkey acquiring that skill transfers telepathically to the next island and the next group of monkeys, and so forth until 100 of them have connected and they have acquired that skill, and then from that point on it spreads island to island to island. So it makes you wonder if there's the 100 humans theory. So
right,
that
and in fact,
that talent spreads from Egypt to Mexico, but without anybody traveling directly 4,500 years ago from Egypt to Mexico.
Though Kon-Tiki explores that theory, I believe, by Thor Heyerdahl. Are you familiar with that?
Yes. He's got a theory that's very close to that it's the same thing about telepathic transfer.
Amazing.
So
well,
one of the other things in Mexico when I was 4 that I remember as if it happened yesterday is the cliff divers at Acapulco. These guys dive from about 112 feet, and they're diving into 12 feet of water, and they have to time the incoming waves or tidal surge when it comes in, because when they hit, they have to curve off immediately to avoid hitting the bottom. And I remember all these years later watching these divers with the sunset behind them and being silhouetted against the sun and then hitting the water. And when they hit, there's hardly any ripple at all. And I don't know how they do it, but that has stuck with me. So that's where my travel bug began. And then it got accentuated on a semester abroad program.
Touching back briefly on the 100th monkey, I should mention that on the human level, Carl Jung's collective unconscious bears certain similarity to that.
Which part of Jung's philosophy are you talking about?
Collective unconscious is the idea that we all have shared memory of ancestral memory, stuff that our ancestors did perhaps hundreds or thousands of years ago, that's sort of, shall we say, genetically passed on, that it's there in our subconscious mind. And I certainly buy into that. I think Carl Jung was onto something.
I think that happens on an individual level also. I think that our collective memory, if you believe in reincarnation like I do, that you pass on, and I know that you do as well, and a lot of our friends that we share in common, that collective memory from lifetime to lifetime creates a thread, a commonality that you have from lifetime to lifetime. In each lifetime we are a personality, but there's a collective thread that we have in common from lifetime to lifetime, and that collective memory that you speak of that Jung refers to is part of that. It's something you can tap into. That's the beautiful part.
Absolutely. Well, what's your goal for how many countries and why? Do you have a particular number, or could you tell us a little about that?
Well, the number, Rich, is not precise, but there's 196 official countries in the United Nations, and my goal is to hit all of them. And then there's some unofficial countries that are territorial disputes, or they're kind of right next to one country but really belong to another, and so they're cat scratching about who really owns this country. And situations like Taiwan, which has been politically displaced by China. Taiwan naturally should be a member of the United Nations, but because China has so much throw weight, Taiwan will never be allowed to be a part of the United Nations. They'll always be vetoed by China. And so that's a country, and I visited that, but it's not an official UN member nation. So my goal is to reach all 196 and as many of the misfits that I can on top of that. I'm halfway home, by the way. I've been to 95, so I'm about halfway there.
Halfway there. Well, what have been your favorites to date, and why?
It's a very good question. That could take up an entire program in itself, but I'll try to make this brief. I had my semester abroad program in Great Britain, and that basically involved Whitehall in London, but I also went to Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. So my first foray, really, aside from Mexico and Canada, I got a chance to go to 5 countries. And so I really learned to like the Lakes District in England. And then later on, some of my favorites were Tuscany in Italy and the Dordogne Valley in France, which was the dividing line essentially between the English part of France at the time of Henry V, when England dominated the northern part of France, and the southern part of France. And the really interesting part about that, the Dordogne River, there's castles of different styles that lined on either side of the river. And these guys would be fighting, the French and English soldiers would be fighting each other during the day, but at night they would get together and they would drink and they would dine and they would basically carouse together. And then about 10 minutes before sunrise, the warning was essentially, get your ass back in the rowboat. You've got 10 minutes and we start firing on you again. So it made for a really interesting 12 hours were enemies and 12 hours were buddies sort of scenario. And then beyond that, the White Cliff towns in Spain are spectacular, and I can describe that at greater length later. The Sacred Valley of the Incas in Peru, Mongolia, is just because it's so different and so isolated. And when I went into Mongolia, I had no idea what to expect, and so I got to completely play it by the hoof and really, really appreciated being out on the Mongolian steppes and living in a yurt, for example. North Korea. North Korea is a big charade. It is all set up to convince their own people that they have a high standard of living and that these rumors that they hear about their fellow countrymen starving are fabrications of their enemies, that it's not true. It is true. About 10% of their populace is starving. But it's just a remarkable farce that has been fabricated in North Korea to try to compete with the South Koreans, which obviously has a much better economy, a much better standard of living, much better acceptedness throughout the world community. And they take turns competing with the United States, and they take turns competing with South Korea, but mainly with the United States, oddly enough. And I can speak more in detail about that later also.
Okay.
And then I also loved Rwanda. Rwanda has been a remarkable case of recovery since their genocide 20 years ago, and it's truly a beautiful country. It's kind of a combination of Thailand and Hawaii and Costa Rica. And they have a day each month that's very democratic, where everybody goes out and picks up trash, and that makes it a most unusual country for Africa, because Africa is a pretty trashed place. People just don't care. They take paper wrappers and they throw it on the ground, and it blows around all over the place, and they really don't care. And you particularly see that at public transport places, bus stops and restaurants and things like that. Well, Rwanda is an exception to that. And among those who picks up the trash is the president. He also spends one day a month walking around picking up trash. So they have quite a bit of esprit de corps and camaraderie and a sense of being one. And that has been encouraged by their president, Paul Kagame, who was on the winning side finally at the end of the genocide in 1994. And it was his posture in an Abraham Lincoln sort of way that dictated, we are no longer Hutu, we are no longer Tutsi, we are Rwandans. There is no more tribal affiliation anymore. And he also made sure that they didn't have retribution trials where they imprisoned a lot of people or they executed a lot of people in revenge. He just said, no, we're going to be Rwandans again, and we're not going to have revenge in the same way that Abraham Lincoln, before his assassination, decided that in 1865 here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
My last favorite, I'd say, would be Israel. Israel is a beautiful, beautiful country, very smart people, very crafty, very intelligent, very surrounded, of course, feeling a little bit, in some ways, left out of the world community because the world has bought into this Palestinian victimhood. And if you have boots on the ground and you get a chance to see